Benson walked a little unevenly. The little ball of light, his flashlight shown upon the ground, wobbled to and fro in tune with his unsteady gait. He was a security guard at the site where Emerson's grand housing project would soon begin construction in earnest after almost a year of legal wrangling and delays. Up until a week ago, he had been partnered with Alan Walsh, but Walsh had been a no-show for the week, and Paul had been walking the fences alone. Walsh's disappearance was the talk of the town, since he had, it seemed, run out on his young wife. His very pregnant young wife, as it turned out. Benson didn't buy that. They had spent a lot of long nights out here guarding the hulking machines that lay waiting for the day they could rev their engines and bring this stretch of forest down, and the man had spoken often of how much he was looking forward to being a dad. Benson wasn't a great judge of character, but the guy seemed sincere enough. When he wasn't walking the grounds these days, he was drinking Coors Light in the shed that acted as a security center. Not that there was much to guard at the moment. The equipment had stood stagnant for months as the courts decided if the land belonged to Emerson and his money or the Indians and their traditions, and would have remained so for months more if the main force standing against the construction hadn't been killed. A Native American lawyer named Black, shortened by some ancestor from Black Feather years prior, had been standing in the way of Emerson's progress, forestalling the man and costing him a great deal of money, the one thing on earth that Emerson seemed to care about. Then one night, in what was labeled a botched home invasion, both Black and his wife, also an outspoken opponent of the construction initiative, were killed. Everyone thought Emerson had had them killed, but like the old saying goes, knowing something and proving something are two very different animals. Emerson owned everything of value around these parts and had a reputation as being ruthless and not above doing anything to extend his grip on the local land and the money to be made behind it. Was he capable of murder if it would save him millions? Paul thought so. According to most folks, he owned the cops, he owned the courts, hell, he practically owned the fucking air everybody breathed. No mere lawyer could stand against Emerson's wave of progress. Black had been destined to be chopped down just as much as these trees in this area were, except the lawyer had stood tall and was on the verge of stopping Emerson completely when he and his wife were gunned down. So very soon, the bulldozers and backhoes would resume their labors, and life would continue moving forward. You can't hold back progress. Benson was just at that edge where slightly tipsy teeters over and falls into the land of very drunk. He was wobbling and a little nauseous and really just wanted to get back to the shed and finish what he had started, namely a six-pack. It had been a hell of a lot more fun when Alan had been here to share the evenings, and occasional beer, with him. His vanishing act had been as abrupt as it had been titillating, and it was the big thing now that the murdered Indian couple and the battle over this land were finally dying down. Even though Alan hadn't had more than one beer a night, he was still fun to be around, and nobody wants to get drunk alone. It was actually kind of creepy out here without someone to back him up, even with 9 feet of fence between him and the woods. Ah, damn it all, now he had to pay. He placed his flashlight on the ground, teetering at the edge of balance and almost falling down as he did so, and then steadied himself. It had been a very near thing, and he was starting to rethink finishing the beer that was left in the shed. He unzipped his fly and fished his cock out, pulling it through the leg hole of his underwear rather than the window in the front. Once you poked your dick through that damn thing, it always seemed to worm its way back through, no matter how hard you try to keep it tucked away, usually with the balls in tow. Penises really are a pain in the ass, he thought to himself in slurred logic, and then laughed at the inferred sexual slant that sentence conjured. He leaned one hand against the fence and voided his bladder into the trees, his piss sending wisps of steam into the night air. He let out a soft moan as he did so, unaware that he had even made a sound. He finished up, shook his cock, and let loose any drops of piss that might be hiding within his member, and tucked himself away. Zipped up gingerly, and then he carefully bent and picked up his flashlight. Paul suddenly had a severe case of the heebie-jeebies, and wanted very badly to get back to his cabin. His senses seemed tuned up, and his muscles were jumpy, like he was about to start a race or had done a bad hit of cocaine. He stood stock still and trained his light along the tree line on the other side of the fence. Nothing. Not a goddamn thing. He let out the breath he had not even noticed he had been holding and turned away, beginning to walk back to the shed. That was when what had given him pause finally hit him. The crickets, the night owls, and the scurrying things that hid in the underbrush, the entire nightly cacophony that usually accompanied him on these nocturnal journeys, were absent. He stood in absolute silence, his ragged breath that spilled visibly from his mouth the only sound around him. Even that seemed too great a noise in all this quiet, and he held it for a moment. Breathing reached his ears, despite the fact that his own breath was locked tightly within his tightened chest. The breathing was ragged, sickly. The breathing of a heavy smoker climbing stairs. Paul Benson was suddenly glad he had pissed, because had he not, he would have done so right now, down his leg like a baby. The breathing was coming from the trees on the other side of the fence. It was a deep inhale, then a long whistling exhalation. Whatever it was drawing that tortured breath made no other sound. It didn't rustle so much as a leaf. Paul backed slowly away from the fence toward the cabin, keeping his flashlight beam trained on the point where he thought the sound was coming from. One step, another, a tentative third. His hidden observer moved then, and came forward into the beam of his flashlight. The beast was hunched over, but at its full height it would probably have been as high as the fence. It stalked forward on its lupine legs and swung its arms in a hideously exaggerated parody of human steps, like a grown man pretending the gait of an ape. Its long arms dragged along just inches from the forest floor, which he could not even see because the earth was buried beneath an unnaturally dense fog that swirled through the fence like a thing alive, creeping along the ground and questing ethereal tentacles that were straining towards him. He couldn't move. He simply could not drag his eyes from the eyes of the beast as it stared at him, rooting him to the spot. The creature brought its hands up to the fence and grasped it with unnervingly human-looking fingers. Each digit sported a hooked talon easily 3 inches in length. Drool spilled from its mouth, only to freeze as it fell to the matted, pale pelt of its belly. It cocked its head at its paw, and then raised its snout and let forth a howl that sliced through him deeply. No damned soul condemned to the pits had ever produced a more mournful cry. It started out deep and resonant, held that note for a bit, and then dragged down through the lower register in a final hoarse breath. As the howl ebbed, the creature gripped the wire and pulled. The fence would have withstood hurricane-force winds, yet the barrier between Paul and this horror from the woods was ripped apart with ridiculous, terrifying ease. That got Paul moving. He turned and stumbled toward the only shelter at hand. His stumbling run was not a thing of epic tales, and given the monster's size, it should have ended with its death after less than 3 steps. He kept going, though, certain every step would be his last. His panic lent him what speed it could, and somehow he reached the shed alive. He opened the door and fell inside. He scrambled toward the lone desk in the place and crawled beneath it, curling up into the fetal position and facing the wall, his eyes clenched tightly shut. There was no logic to this, just an animal need to hide from a predator coupled with a child's certainty that no matter how much the monster wanted him, if he was out of sight, he was safe. So he huddled, shivering, and hid. Whatever it was could not find him here. The door to the shed swung open, the spring that shut the door automatically screeching. It let in a draft of ungodly cold air, and he shivered, though whether that was due to the cold or the extent of his terror he couldn't say. It could not find him. The shed creaked as something heavy, something that breathed in ragged breaths, found purchase on its floor. It would not find him. Wisps of cold air, gossamer tentacles, caressed his exposed flesh. It would never find him. The drips of what could only be saliva hitting the cheap linoleum floor just behind him. He was safe. The puff of frosted air that blew his hair away from the nape of his neck, freezing the skin there. He was gonna die. No! Could a whisper be so loud? The breath faltered. The shed creaked again as the thing retreated with a dissatisfied snarl. The cold went with it, and Paul realized that he had apparently not completely avoided his bladder outside as warm piss was pooled beneath him. He lay there and breathed and marveled at his being alive. He felt the world tilt a little and realized he was on the verge of fainting. He didn't even fight it. Just let go and fled from a world where reality no longer made sense and 9-foot-tall monsters stalked the wood. As the darkness finally closed in, Paul heard the sounds of the beast in rage, indulging in an orgy of destruction outside. It made for troubling dreams.